Well, my name is David indeed, Dave Korthals. I pretty much moved to London back in 2014, simply because I thought life was a bit boring back in the Netherlands, so I really fancied a change. Applied for a job in London, worked for a Leaders Group for the first 3 years, then I moved on to Salt, a digital recruitment company, worked there for about 3 years, and then I actually got contacted by Investigo, who needed some desperate help with getting their European operations in order. And I've done that for about a year and a half, and then all of a sudden I got contacted by yourself that I was nominated for this award, for which I'm incredibly grateful. It's a really great question. I just applied for a job at a recruitment company. To be honest with you, at the time I didn't really know what to expect. When I actually did study kind of labour and commercial law, so I felt if you do work for a recruitment company, back in the days I'd only ever heard of Manpower or Randstad. That's actually the way the Dutch tend to pronounce it. So I really heard about recruitment, but I didn't really know what it entailed, so I didn't have any expectations whatsoever. When I actually did have my interview back in 2014 at the Leaders Group, I felt like, this is great, guys, because I could see all these kind of hungry kind of 20-year-olds, picking up the phone and start dialing. It really felt, it felt to me like, wow, this is the Wolf of Wall Street. Obviously my job was going to be different, but what I was really looking for was kind of a very energetic workplace, and in that respect recruitment ticks all the boxes, doesn't it? That I actually don't know, because I never worked in the recruitment scene back in the Netherlands. What I would say, the big difference I think with especially the likes of London is the working hours, that many people down here find it's much more common to work longer hours, right? You definitely work 8:30 to 6, potentially a bit longer, whereas in the Netherlands I felt like, and I could be completely wrong, but generally speaking when I speak to customers, suppliers down there, it's more like a 9 to 5 environment. So I think that's one of the big difference. Also the idea that everything needs to be done ASAP is definitely a London thing.
Yes.
I don't think you have that anywhere else, apart from maybe some other big cities like New York, Hong Kong, etc., etc. But the ASAP thing, things need to be done very quickly, is really a London thing. And sometimes, especially in my job, sometimes that can be quite challenging. So managing expectations is key, really. I would just say, calm down, relax, but pick up the phone and have a conversation with the person, because I find that speaking to many people over the phone saves me a considerable amount of time. I would still, to back myself up, confirm everything in email, but usually having actually a conversation with someone, even meeting face to face, is a great way sometimes to really manage expectations and just say, listen, I can do it within that time frame, is that okay with you? And if I say, well, I want to get it done with the next 5 minutes, it's very easy to say, well, listen, this is a 30-page document. Realistically speaking, there's no turnaround the same day, right? But what I can do is, send it to you by lunchtime tomorrow. Is that okay with you? And actually 99% of the cases, especially if people are kind of reasonable, that's okay with them. I usually think it's quite important to let people know up front, without going too much into the SLA of things, like this is usually the turnaround I need. But also, in some circumstances, it's also good to exceed people's expectations. So you just do it a bit quicker than promised, really.
Yeah.
But I think it's most important usually, what are the timelines here? When do candidates start? In recruitment, in my view, the most important thing is that to a degree you secure the candidates and you make sure the candidate's happy. They've kind of agreed to all the to the draft terms. With the client, I would still push that you get all the terms across. In an ideal world, you would get it before the interview stage, but that's usually wishful thinking. But ideally before the start of the placement, that you've managed to review all the documentation, and especially a good recruitment consultant will understand that terms, unfortunately, albeit they're a bit boring, are important. And the good people just actually set up a call. You can then attend the call with the client. The recruitment consultant will witness it, add their points, and in most cases, 99% of the cases, should come to an agreement. But yeah, it's all about managing expectations. Is, I would say, about 85% of my job.
Yeah. And how do you?
Yeah, sales prevention unit is typically attached to it, sometimes for good reason, I would say. But again, I think the legal and compliance kind of people, what we all need to consider is, it usually works way better to say, that's fine, provided, as opposed to, no, we can't do that for these reasons. So that doesn't really, there's still kind of some scenarios where I would say absolutely out of the question. But the interesting thing is what you mentioned, like, we were regarded as sales prevention units because we were just seen as the people who just needed to sign off a particular deal, and that's still the case. But despite, COVID has caused so many casualties, so many deaths, and that's terrible, but it's also dramatically changed the landscape, and it has actually positively impacted hopefully the reputation of the legal and compliance professionals. And the reason is because people can work from anywhere, and because of legislation is becoming more and more complicated, people now actually, even sales teams, understand that they need a legal and compliance professional in their team, because they are the ones who are supposed to understand the rules, work around those rules in a compliant manner, or at least act within the kind of spirit of the rules, but try and be creative as possible, and present them with opportunities, solutions. And as opposed to, like, can you sign off this deal, it's now more like, yeah, we're going to place some 30 contractors in Germany. Do you know how to do that? Yeah, I think so. Right, well, let's get on with it then. So all of a sudden they need you a lot more than they did back in the days, because back in the days, many recruitment companies in the UK, many of them placed in the UK, they all knew the difference between inside and outside IR35, most of them did, and it was more like, come on, let's place people, we've got these standard contracts in place, let's place people. Whereas these days, it's more like, we've got a client who's based in France, a contractor who's based in the UK, an MSP based in the Netherlands. I'm trying to make it a bit more complicated than it really is, but where do we start with this? What are the rules? What's the legislation like? What kind of contracts do we need to get in place? So because of all these kind of developments, I do generally believe that it's a much more commercially, it's a much more commercial role, and a lot more important to recruitment business. Also, because I need to have much more in-depth conversations with our clients about compliance these days. Yeah, I think Brexit, everyone was really scared about Brexit, and because it hasn't really impacted the services industry that much, I think it hasn't really been as bad as people predicted. It was more like in the interesting thing is, so when Brexit actually happened, everyone was worrying. European customers felt like, do you have a European entity? We don't really want to pay your UK entity anymore. And then when Brexit finally kind of occurred, it was more like, well, things from a transactional point of view haven't really changed. So everything really went back to normal. What I think is actually really what we're seeing at the moment is IR35 obviously in the UK. So although I don't really think HMRC is going to enforce their policy to a great extent in the private sector this year, something will happen next year. But what is happening is that many big banks, many big companies, they really feel they're getting audited at some stage, so they will start auditing the recruitment industry at some point. That will happen. What we've seen as well is the UK authorities tightening up their laws in the sense that they want companies to have anti-tax avoidance of evasion measures in place. So businesses actually need to have in place measures to combat any tax evasion, tax avoidance practices. So you need to make sure that your contractor is adequately registered, for example. That could be one of the things that you need to take care of. You don't really want to be guilty of paying offshore kind of structures. So you need to make sure that companies and contractors are, in principle, contractors are registered in the country where they perform the work. There hasn't been any major enforcement action to my knowledge, but the legislation was introduced in 2017. but the government actually has announced that now some investigations pending, so we'll probably hear more about it. But I think the most important thing is, like I said before, is that people can work from anywhere. It's more like, how do you make sure you've got the right partners in place and you've got the infrastructure in place to find solutions for contractors quite quickly, especially if those contractors are not based in the UK, are not based in the territory where you're familiar with. You need to have those solutions available, otherwise you just lose the deal. When I started working for Investigo, they placed many kind of contractors in Europe. So what I said was, we need to do a country-specific analysis. We need to understand what documents are required for each contractor, right? Do we need any licenses? So the first couple of months I was just really mapping what countries will predominantly kind of place people. Then found out what documents do we need to obtain. And thanks again, Six Cats and John Lemaire for providing all sorts of interesting insights. So that was a major job, and then what we did, we actually just summarised what these people needed to submit, and ultimately what we did is we kind of created our own onboarding tool so that people can upload their documents very quickly.
Oh, nice.
But those are the things you can do. So digitalisation is extremely important, and although I'm not an IT person, I think every compliance professional now needs to start thinking about how to make processes more digital. And onboarding contractors, onboarding compliance to some extent, the more you can use your CRM system for that, the more efficient you can kind of do these deals. What you could think about is we're in the process of kind of creating FAQs, so that instead of just answering the same question 20 times, you just give people a one-pager full of FAQs, and that can be forwarded to the contractor or the client. And if first aid is not sufficient, they can then reach out to us, and I can then give either the contractor or the client or whoever a more in-depth response. So it's all about saving yourself time. And then all of a sudden, I think a compliance team, you become the unsung heroes because you essentially save people time. That's maybe ultimately, you try and mitigate the risk of getting fined, but maybe even more importantly, you're trying to save the business time and you give them expertise in return. I've got to be careful with what I'm saying, but probably I've got the authorities will just storm in a few moments, but there is a big grey area. Some things are not black and white. Some of them are, and then I would say, if you deem yourself, if you're a reputable company, do what's fair. But there are many areas that are a bit grey, and the best way to, I would say, kind of paint them or just dress them up is to have conversations with everyone. Then say, this is what we feel, that this is not the compliant way of doing things. Let's get it compliant. Especially, and most of the time, that should all be commercially feasible. And then you just write it down. But I think it's all about communication and just showing you're a professional business. And I don't think all clients would treasure it, but I think there's a significant amount of clients these days who actually care more about compliance, because ultimately, if we are the recruiter, we act actually in our client's interest. If we decide to turn a blind eye to it, then ultimately the client can also get chased by either the regulators or by any third parties. So it's really important if we take into account that we need to serve the best interest of the client, then ultimately we also need to be open and transparent to our client. But also act actually as almost an advisor. So not just on, here's the best possible. Well, it's more like twofold. Like, here's the best possible candidate for the job because they've got the best resume. But this person also operates in a compliant manner. This is predominantly relevant to contracting, by the way. Take responsibility for your own development, because quite often recruitment companies don't really have the expertise, knowledge and capacity to train people up. There's not a designated handbook for compliance professionals. I mean, obviously what you can do, what I'm thinking about is, for example, doing the legal executive route, but that would be predominantly focused on the UK. So there's a large part, of course, that to a degree, you need to have the willingness to be self-taught, do research, use Google to an extent. Although many people say it's not reliable, but there's an awful lot of information you can find. It's always quite useful. And be very proactive and kind of also try and understand what's really important in the market, what types of legislation are kind of key to assess. So I decided, many years ago, GDPR kind of came into force and everyone was scared about it. So I felt like I need to know more about this. So I did a qualification. There's no real handbook, and I don't think anyone will tell you this is exactly what you need to do. But I think a commercial contracts background is useful, or having the ability to review contracts and negotiate them is, I would say, a must for this role. But then also the willingness to do kind of legal research, to understand the countries you're operating, and also constantly kind of think about how can I commercially benefit the company? How can I be commercially savvy enough to make this role a success as well? And how can I show them that a legal compliance professional who's really willing to expand their knowledge about other territories can really be of added value to the business. Ultimately I would say, try and understand your markets, do an awful lot of research and take ownership yourself. And maybe sometimes if you feel that within one company you can't progress, because sometimes you're a bit dependent, of course, on where they place all the contractors, right, where business is done. So sometimes you have to switch to another business that gives you that exposure. And I'm really glad that Investigo have been there for almost kind of 2 years. I started off as head of European compliance. I moved to an overall kind of more like head of overall compliance role. There are just many challenges ahead of me, and many projects that need to be pretty much worked on.